Imagine driving on a highway in January, somewhere in upstate New York or Minnesota. The temperature outside is negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow is piling up on the windshield, and you glance down at your electric car's dashboard. The range indicator says you have about 150 miles left. You feel a small wave of relief, but you know from experience that number is a lie. By the time you crank up the heat, defrost the windows, and battle the wind resistance, that number is going to drop like a stone. Within 30 minutes, you have lost almost 40% of your range. The battery isn't broken, nothing is mechanically wrong, it is just too damn cold outside. Lithium batteries, the ones that power almost every electric vehicle on the planet, simply cannot handle extreme cold. The electrolyte inside them turns into a thick, syrupy sludge that makes it nearly impossible for the charged particles to move freely. The resistance spikes, the available capacity vanishes, and you are left stranded with a car that promised you the future, but delivered a winter nightmare. Now, imagine a different scenario. Same highway, same blizzard, same negative 20 degrees, but this time, your car is powered by a battery made from one of the most abundant, cheapest, and most boring materials on Earth. Ordinary table salt. The dashboard shows your range, and it stays steady. The heater runs, the defroster works, and you arrive at your destination without a single panic attack. That is not a fantasy, it is not a science project, and it is not a press release from a startup that will go bankrupt in 2 years. That is the reality of a technology that has been quietly waiting in the shadows for 40 years, and it just got its first real shot at global domination. In April of 2026, the largest battery manufacturer in the world, a company that produces more energy storage than anyone else on the planet, signed a single order that changed everything. The deal was for 60 gigawatt-hours of sodium-ion batteries. To put that number into a perspective that actually means something, 60 gigawatt-hours is enough electricity to power every single home in New York City for about 2 weeks. And here is the part that makes your brain itch. 12 months before that contract was signed, sodium-ion batteries had not even entered mass commercial production. You have seen the headlines over the last few years. Samsung phones catching fire in people's pockets. Electric vehicles spontaneously combusting in garages. Grid-scale storage facilities going up in flames in New York and California. And the root cause of all of those disasters is the same chemical weakness that makes lithium batteries lose range in the cold. Lithium is volatile, it is reactive, it is sensitive to temperature, to manufacturing defects, to overcharging. That is not a bad batch or a specific manufacturer's mistake. That is the fundamental chemistry of the element itself. Lithium is the lightest metal on the periodic table, and that lightness is what gives it incredible energy density, but it also makes it inherently unstable. The liquid electrolyte that carries the ions back and forth is flammable. When a dendrite grows and punctures the separator, the battery shorts out and ignites. That is physics, not bad luck. And for decades, we have been willing to accept that trade-off because lithium gave us smartphones, laptops, and long-range EVs. We tolerated the volatility because there was no alternative. The cost of that tolerance has been measured in burned homes, grounded flights, and a global supply chain that is so concentrated it makes OPEC look like a diversified portfolio. Here is the shocking truth that most people completely miss. Sodium-ion batteries are not a new invention. They are not a sudden breakthrough that appeared out of nowhere. In fact, the concept has been around since the 1980s. In 1980, Ford Motor Company, yes, that Ford, actually tried to build a sodium-sulfur battery for electric vehicles. But there was a massive problem that made the project completely impractical. They had to heat the battery to 300 degrees Celsius just to get the ions moving. That is the temperature of a self-cleaning oven. And you cannot put that inside a passenger vehicle without turning it into a mobile furnace. The idea was dead on arrival. Then, in the late 1990s, the Nobel Prize-winning work on lithium-ion batteries exploded, and the entire world went all in on lithium. Billions of dollars flowed into lithium mining, processing, and manufacturing. Sodium was relegated to a footnote in academic journals, a curious anomaly that never quite made it out of the lab. The killer problem for sodium, the one that stumped scientists for decades, was the size of the ion itself. Sodium ions are about 35% larger than lithium ions. That might not sound like much, but at the atomic level, it is a chasm. The most common anode material for lithium batteries is graphite. Graphite has a beautiful, neat, crystalline structure with perfectly spaced layers that lithium ions can slide into and out of with relative ease. It is like a parking garage with spaces that are just the right size for a compact car. Sodium ions, with their larger diameter, simply could not fit into those spaces. They would wedge themselves in, distort the structure, and rapidly destroy the battery. So for 40 years, scientists tried every trick they could think of to shove sodium into graphite, and they failed every single time. It looked like a fundamental, unsolvable physical limitation. But then, in the year 2000, a research team in Canada had a completely counterintuitive breakthrough. Instead of trying to force the sodium ion into a neat, ordered structure, they asked a radical question. What if we abandoned order entirely? What if we used a chaotic, messy, disorganized form of carbon that looked more like a crumpled piece of paper than a parking garage? That messy carbon, which they called hard carbon, was essentially a sponge. It had pores, crevices, and random gaps that were just the right size to absorb the large sodium ions. The ions did not need to slide neatly between layers. They just soaked into the sponge like water into a paper towel. It was a eureka moment that turned sodium's biggest weakness into its greatest strength. The disorder of the hard carbon structure meant that the sodium ions were not wedged into tight, rigid spaces. They could move in and out without causing the same mechanical stress that destroys lithium anodes. That stress relief was the secret to sodium's incredible longevity. Let me tell you what that longevity actually looks like in real numbers, because this is where sodium utterly embarrasses lithium. The latest generation of sodium batteries from CATL, a Chinese company that is the undisputed heavyweight champion of the global battery industry, can endure over 10,000 full charge-discharge cycles before their capacity drops below 80%. If you fully charge and discharge your car every single day, which most people do not, that is more than 27 years of continuous use. Think about that for a minute. 27 years ago, the iPhone did not exist. 27 years ago, Google was just a research project. A sodium battery will outlast the chassis of the car, the interior, the suspension, the electronics, and possibly your ownership of the vehicle. When the car finally rusts away and gets sent to the scrapyard, that battery pack will still have years of useful life left. You could pull it out, install it in a stationary storage system, and run it for another decade or two. This is not a battery, it is a multi-generational asset. In stationary storage applications, the numbers are even more staggering. The TNR sodium storage system, which CATL unveiled in Munich in June of 2026, delivers 15,000 cycles at 70% capacity retention. If a utility company charges and discharges that storage unit once every day, it will operate for 25 to 30 years without needing a single cell replacement. Now compare that to lithium iron phosphate, which is currently the best chemistry for grid storage. LFP batteries typically need to be replaced after about 8 to 10 years. That replacement cost is a massive drag on the economics of renewable energy projects. When you have to rip out thousands of cells and install new ones every decade, the levelized cost of electricity skyrockets. Sodium cuts that replacement cost out almost entirely. The lifetime cost of a sodium storage plant is about 40% lower than an equivalent lithium plant. That is not a marginal improvement. It is a revolution in the economics of the grid. Now, let us talk about the performance advantage that completely changes the game for anyone who lives in a place that gets actual winter. I mentioned the cold weather problem earlier. Lithium batteries lose about 20 to 40% of their range at -20 degrees Celsius. Some of the cheaper chemistries lose even more than that. But sodium batteries, at -20 degrees Celsius, they retain over 92% of their capacity. Drop the temperature down to -40 degrees, which is the kind of bone-cracking cold that makes exposed skin freeze in less than a minute, and sodium still holds nearly 90%. The reason for this difference is the electrolyte. Sodium's electrolyte remains fluid and active even at cryogenic temperatures. The sodium ions have a smaller Stokes radius and a weaker solvation shell, which is a fancy way of saying they slip through the liquid much faster than lithium ions can. In simple terms, sodium is a better winter athlete. This is not just a lab curiosity. The first mass-produced sodium passenger car, a vehicle built by Chang'an Auto in partnership with CATL, already passed its winter testing in Yakaishi, Inner Mongolia, one of the coldest places on the planet. At -30 degrees Celsius, that sodium-powered car delivered nearly 3 times the discharge power of a comparable lithium iron phosphate vehicle. For a driver stuck in a blizzard, that is not a quality-of-life detail, that is a literal safety feature. You need the car to start, you need the defroster to work, and you need the range to hold. Sodium delivers where lithium utterly fails. Chang'an's marketing team has turned this into their core selling point. They are advertising the car as the EV that does not drop the ball in extreme cold. For consumers in Canada, Scandinavia, Russia, and the northern United States, that single sentence is worth more than all the horsepower and 0 to 60 times combined. Let me stop here and address the elephant in the room. You might be thinking, okay, this sounds great, but what about energy density? The one stat that everyone obsesses over when they buy an electric car. Sodium ions are bigger, so they cannot pack as much energy into the same volume as lithium. That has been the canonical argument against sodium for years. But CATL's second-generation Naxtra battery has blown that argument out of the water. The energy density is now 175 watt-hours per kilogram. Do you know what number that is dangerously close to? The average energy density of lithium iron phosphate batteries, the ones used in millions of mass-market EVs today, is about 180 watt-hours per kilogram. The gap has shrunk to a rounding error, and this is not a lab prototype. This is production-ready, off-the-line, commercially available cell technology. What does 175 watt-hours per kilogram actually mean for you? It means a sodium-powered electric car can achieve a range of 400 to 600 kilometers, or about 250 to 370 miles. That is not a dinky city car. That is a legitimate road trip-worthy vehicle. With CATL's third-generation CTP technology, the first mass-produced sodium passenger vehicle already has a certified range exceeding 400 kilometers. The Chief Technology Officer of CATL has publicly stated that they expect to push sodium's energy density to 200 watt-hours per kilogram within the next 3 years. At that level, sodium will not just be competitive with LFP, it will surpass it. The only chemistry that will still have a clear advantage is high-nickel lithium, which sits above 300 watt-hours per kilogram and is reserved for premium sedans, sports cars, and electric aviation. But here is the key insight that most battery analysts completely miss. The market is not a monolith. Not every application needs the absolute highest density. A delivery van, a commuter sedan, or a grid storage facility does not care about shaving off a few grams. They care about cost, safety, and longevity. Sodium has crossed the threshold of good enough. And for the vast majority of consumers and utilities, good enough combined with much cheaper and much safer is an irresistible combination. Lithium will remain the king of the high-end, but sodium will conquer the grungy, massive middle tier. Now let us talk about the economics, because this is where the entire narrative shifts from interesting to inevitable. The price of sodium-ion cells dropped to between 0.35 and 0.40 yuan per watt-hour in the first quarter of 2026. Lithium iron phosphate was hovering around 0.38 yuan. The gap was already down to less than 0.1 yuan. Northeast Securities estimated that the fully loaded cost of a sodium cell is about 0.33 to 0.42 yuan, compared to 0.33 to 0.34 yuan for LFP. The difference is currently held up by the cost of hard carbon for the anode and the electrolyte salts, but that is a solvable problem. Massive production lines for hard carbon are coming online right now. As the volume scales, the price per ton is going to drop off a cliff. CATL has publicly stated that they expect cost parity with LFP by the end of 2026. Bernstein, the research firm, believes sodium will be cheaper than LFP by 2027, with a cost advantage of $15 to $20 per kilowatt-hour. There are still skeptics. Wood Mackenzie has taken a much more conservative view, arguing that cost parity might not arrive until 2035. They point to the learning curve of lithium, which took decades to optimize. But even in the most pessimistic scenario, the raw material advantage of sodium is undeniable. Sodium is the sixth most abundant element on Earth. It makes up about 2.36% of the Earth's crust, and it is incredibly concentrated in seawater. You can extract sodium from ordinary rock salt and ocean water. It is cheap, accessible, and you do not have to drill, blast, or dig massive open-pit mines in environmentally sensitive areas to get it. Lithium, by contrast, is geographically concentrated to an alarming degree. 90% of the world's lithium production comes from just 3 countries: Australia, Chile, and China. China alone processes about 65% of the raw material and produces about 75% of the world's lithium-ion cells. We have already seen what happens when that concentration meets surging demand. Between 2020 and 2022, the price of lithium carbonate skyrocketed by 800%. It did not just go up, it went vertical. Automakers were caught completely flat-footed, scrambling to lock in supply at any cost. Then in 2023, the bubble popped, and prices crashed by more than 70%. You cannot build a stable industry on that kind of chaos. How do you price a car for 2028 when you have no idea what your battery materials will cost? You cannot. You are forced to hedge, to sign risky long-term contracts, and to pass the volatility onto consumers. Sodium's raw material price is stable and predictable because the source is everywhere. You can localize the supply chain almost anywhere on the planet. That stability is worth more than a temporary discount on lithium. This is why the European Union has started to take sodium very seriously. The European Economic and Social Committee issued a formal statement in early 2026 supporting sodium battery technology specifically to reduce the EU's supply chain vulnerability. They called for dedicated funding in the next 7-year budget. Why would they do that? Because Europe does not have much lithium, but it has sodium under its feet. By shifting to sodium, Europe can reduce its dependence on imports from China and South America. It is not just an economic calculation, it is a strategic imperative. And that strategic imperative is exactly why CATL's two major European deals landed where they did. The 5 gigawatt-hour deal with Alphen in the Netherlands and the 2 gigawatt-hour deal with SolarPro in Eastern Europe are not random sales. They are beachheads in a market that has a desperate structural need for storage and a desperate structural weakness in battery manufacturing. Now, let me hit you with the plot twist that completely flips the narrative on its head. The entire sodium revolution was not driven by some visionary scientist who predicted the future. It was driven by lithium's own success. In 2022, when lithium prices went ballistic, the entire automotive industry panicked. They saw that the supply chain was a house of cards. They realized that if they kept betting everything on lithium, they were one trade war or one drought away from disaster. That panic forced the boardrooms of the world's biggest car makers to fund sodium research. It forced CATL to accelerate its sodium program. It forced Chang'an to commit to sodium production. In other words, lithium's own volatility and its own geographic concentration created the perfect conditions for its rival to rise. Lithium dug its own grave, and sodium just walked in and claimed the space. But here is the most important conceptual shift that most people still do not understand. Sodium is not here to kill lithium. That is a narrative that sells clicks and generates outrage, but it is fundamentally wrong. CATL's strategy is not replacement, it is coexistence. They have developed a brilliant architectural innovation called one shell, two cells. It is exactly what it sounds like. You have one physical battery pack, one set of cooling systems, one management interface. Inside that single shell, you can install both sodium and lithium cells. The battery management system is smart enough to decide which chemistry to draw power from based on real-time conditions. If it is freezing outside and the lithium cells are sluggish, the system pulls from the sodium cells, which are perfectly happy. If you are on a long highway trip in the summer and you need maximum range, the system switches to the lithium cell. Each battery operates in its own comfort zone, and neither is ever pushed to its breaking point. This hybrid approach is already being deployed in real projects. In May 2026, Hyperstrong announced a lithium-sodium hybrid storage solution for a massive data center project. That was the first GW-level application of sodium in a hybrid setting. CATL has also confirmed that their production lines can now switch between lithium and sodium with minimal retooling. That is manufacturing flexibility that gives them a massive competitive advantage. They can adjust their output based on real-time market prices and demand signals. If lithium prices spike, they crank up the sodium lines. If the hard carbon supply tightens, they shift back to lithium. They are playing chess while their competitors are playing checkers. Industry analysts have started to model what this dual chemistry world will look like. Morgan Stanley projects that sodium will grow from about 2% of the battery market in 2027 to 20% by 2030 and 37% by 2035. That is not a niche, that is a massive chunk of the industry. Chang'an and CATL have jointly defined this era as the dual chemistry era. They expect sodium to capture about 50% of the energy storage market and about 20% of the new energy vehicle market by the end of 2026. Those are numbers that would have been laughed out of the room just 2 years ago. Let me give you the timeline for the commercial rollout, because this is where the abstraction becomes concrete. The world's first mass-production sodium passenger car, the Chang'an Chiwan A06, is hitting the market in mid-2026. It is not a concept, it is not a prototype, and it is not a compliance car designed to satisfy some regulatory quota. It is a real car that you can buy. The cold weather tests are done, the certifications are filed, and the production lines are running. And this is not a one-off experiment. Chang'an has committed to using sodium batteries across its entire brand portfolio, including its premium AVATR brand, the D-Pulse series, the Qiyuan series, and the UI series. CATL is their exclusive sodium supplier. That means CATL has locked in a massive long-term revenue stream that justifies the billions they have spent on R&D. Commercial vehicles are moving even faster. In January 2026, CATL launched the Tianxing 2 solution, a dedicated sodium system for light commercial vehicles, the kinds of small trucks and medium-sized vans that handle last-mile deliveries. These vehicles have a 45 kilowatt-hour battery pack, and they are designed to handle extreme cold and heavy loads. If you are a logistics company operating in the northern United States or Canada, this is a game changer. You cannot afford to have your delivery vans losing half their range in a snowstorm. With sodium, they do not. The adoption in commercial fleets is going to accelerate even faster than consumer adoption because fleet managers obsess over total cost of ownership. They do not care about prestige or acceleration, they care about cents per mile. Beyond Chang'an, sodium is appearing in a rapidly expanding list of vehicles. It is being integrated into the JAC Ion UT, the Chang'an Oshang 520, the JAC logistics vehicles, and it is slated for the Geely Xingyuan, the Chery QQ3, and the FWAE 03. The diversity of these applications proves that the technology is robust. It works in hatchbacks, sedans, small trucks, and stationary warehouses. It is practically a universal energy solution for the mid-tier market. Wu Kai, CATL's chief scientist, stood on stage at the 2026 Equipment Power Forum and made a statement that should be framed on the wall of every energy investor. He said that sodium-ion batteries would enter mass-scale production in the fourth quarter of 2026 and would simultaneously push into 4 major applications: battery swapping, passenger vehicles, commercial vehicles, and stationary storage. Battery swapping is a particularly clever play. If you are using sodium in a swap station, the station itself can keep the batteries at optimal temperature, which eliminates even the slightest risk of cold degradation. And when you combine sodium's incredible cycle life with swapping, the economics become almost too good to ignore. Now, I need to address the geopolitical anxiety that is probably lingering in the back of your mind. We are inundated with stories about the battery war with China. We hear about export controls, rare earths, and supply chain decoupling. It is easy to look at CATL's dominance and feel threatened. It is easy to say, oh great, now they are going to own the next generation too. But if you look closely at the strategy, it paints a very different picture. CATL is not trying to create a monopoly. They are actively licensing the one shell, two cells architecture to encourage widespread adoption. Why would they do that? Because they want the standard to become universal. They want the entire world to adopt this dual chemistry model because that means they get to supply the batteries for it. It is a classic strategy of making the pie bigger rather than fighting for crumbs. Moreover, the United States and Europe have a genuine window of opportunity here. Because sodium is abundant everywhere, they do not have to rely on CATL forever. They can build their own sodium supply chains. The EU has already started moving in this direction, and the US could follow suit. The competition in sodium is far more democratic than the competition in lithium, because the raw materials are not locked under a handful of salt flats in the Andes. So when you look at the threat of China dominating this space, it actually pushes the West to invest more in domestic manufacturing, which is a positive outcome. It is a healthy competition, not a fatal one. Now let me bring you back to the fundamental irony of this entire story. The technology for sodium batteries has been sitting in academic journals and research papers for over 40 years. It has been waiting for the world to catch up. It waited for materials science to invent hard carbon, which was finally discovered in 2000. It waited for manufacturing technology to cheaply produce it at scale, and it waited for a crisis, the lithium price shock of 2022, to open the door. That crisis was the trigger that forced the industry to take sodium seriously. In a strange twist of fate, lithium's own success created the conditions for its rival to thrive. The king built the throne and then tripped over it. The 60 gigawatt-hour order is the sound of that door slamming open. The technology is no longer in the future. It is in the present. The cars are being built, the storage facilities are being wired up, and the orders are being signed at a pace that is terrifying the incumbents. The only thing that can stop sodium now is if lithium prices crash to zero, which they absolutely will not. The lithium market will continue to be volatile, concentrated, and geopolitically fraught. That is not a prediction, that is a structural reality. So what does this mean for you, the person watching this video? It means that your next electric car might be sodium-powered, especially if you live in a cold climate. It means that the electricity you use at home might come from a storage farm that uses sodium cells. It means that the supply chain for energy storage is about to become much more diverse, much more resilient, and much less dependent on a handful of countries. And it means that the era of a single, do-everything battery chemistry is officially over. The future is a patchwork quilt of technologies. Lithium, sodium, solid-state, and flow batteries will all have their place. But right now, in 2026, the brightest spotlight is on sodium. I want to leave you with a thought that I hope stays with you long after this video ends. The story of sodium is not just about a battery chemistry. It is about the slow, stubborn, relentless march of scientific progress. It is about a solution that was always there, waiting for us to get smart enough to use it. It is about how the market, with all its chaos and greed, can sometimes accidentally solve problems that governments and academics could not crack for decades. And most of all, it is a reminder that nothing is permanent in technology. The king never rules forever. The dominant technology of today is always vulnerable to an underdog that has been biding its time in the dark. So the next time you see a headline about battery technology, do not just assume it is about lithium. The game has changed. The battery in your future phone might still be lithium, but the battery in the massive storage farm that keeps your grid stable will almost certainly be sodium. The battery that lets you start your car without a panic attack during a blizzard in Minnesota, that is sodium. The battery that makes renewable energy cheaper than coal, that is sodium too. And the battery that finally breaks the world's addiction to volatile concentrated supply chains, that is sodium as well. This is the most exciting time in energy technology since the invention of the lithium-ion battery itself. We are witnessing the birth of a new industrial standard, and it is happening at breakneck speed. The one constant in technology is that nothing is permanent, and right now, sodium is knocking on the door, and it is bringing a massive 60 gigawatt-hour check with it. This is not the beginning of the end for lithium. This is the beginning of the diversification of energy, and that makes the entire grid stronger, cheaper, and more reliable for all of us. But I want to hear from you. Would you actually buy a sodium-powered car if it was cheaper but slightly heavier than a lithium equivalent? Or would you stick with the chemistry that has been proven over decades? Drop a comment with either sodium or lithium and tell me why you made that choice. I read every single comment, and I promise your arguments will make this debate a lot more interesting. And if you want to stay ahead of the next massive shift in energy technology, hit that subscribe button, because this story is far from over, and the next chapter might be even more surprising than this one.